On February 20th, 2026, the USS Gerald R. Ford transited the Strait of Gibraltar and entered the Mediterranean Sea. It did not keep going east toward the Persian Gulf. It did not sail south through the Suez Canal toward the Red Sea, where the USS Abraham Lincoln was already operating. It stopped in the eastern Mediterranean, approximately 1,200 miles from Iran's coastline, and began launching aircraft. To people watching the deployment from the outside, this seemed like the cautious choice. The Ford was the world's largest and most advanced aircraft carrier. Iran was the target. Why was the most powerful ship in the American fleet sitting 1,200 miles away while the Lincoln did the dangerous work closer to Iran? The answer requires understanding that every decision about where to position a carrier is a weapon system decision. The Ford was not 1,200 miles away from Iran, despite being the most powerful carrier in the fleet. It was 1,200 miles away from Iran because it was the most powerful carrier in the fleet. And that 1,200 miles was not a buffer. It was a trap. Start with what the USS Gerald R. Ford actually is. The Ford is the first ship of a new class of carrier that is categorically different from the Nimitz-class ships that preceded it. Every previous American carrier since the 1950s has launched aircraft using steam catapults, systems that use pressurized steam to accelerate aircraft down the flight deck to flying speed. The Ford uses the electromagnetic aircraft launch system, EMALS, which uses electrical linear induction motors to do the same job with greater precision, less stress on aircraft airframes, and dramatically faster recharge times between launches. The practical difference is sortie generation rate, how many aircraft the carrier can launch per hour. A Nimitz-class carrier can sustain approximately 120 sorties per day at surge rate. The Ford's design targets 160 sorties per day, with the potential to reach higher rates as the system matures. The difference between 120 and 160 sorties per day in a sustained air campaign is not marginal. It is the difference between maintaining air superiority over one theater and two. The Ford also carried an air wing configured differently from the Lincoln's. While the Lincoln embarked F-A 18 Super Hornets and F-35C Lightning IIs along with electronic warfare and early warning aircraft, the Ford's air wing included 4 F-A-18 squadrons plus its EA-18G Growler electronic warfare squadron and E-2D advanced Hawkeye aircraft. The Ford does not carry F-35Cs. In a design irony that has generated significant commentary, the Navy's most advanced carrier was delivered without the maintenance systems required to operate its most advanced aircraft. But for the mission the Ford was assigned in February 2026, it did not need F-35Cs. It needed the ability to generate enormous numbers of sorties over the eastern Mediterranean theater at sustained rates, while simultaneously defending against the Iranian retaliation that the planning teams knew was coming. The Mediterranean position provided exactly the leverage that the operational plan required. To understand the strategic logic of the Ford's Mediterranean position, start with a map and think like a targeting officer. Iran's primary long-range offensive capability against American carriers consisted of ballistic missiles and cruise missiles launched from its territory. The most capable of these, the Fateh II hypersonic glide vehicle, has a range of approximately 1,500 kilometers. The longer-range Khorram-Shah ballistic missile has a range approaching 2,000 kilometers. The Persian Gulf, where Iranian conventional naval doctrine expected to engage American forces, is less than 100 kilometers wide in its narrowest section. A carrier in the Persian Gulf is inside the engagement envelope of every anti-ship weapon in Iran's arsenal. Not the best weapons, not just the long-range systems. Everything Iran has: coastal artillery, fast attack craft, submarine-launched torpedoes, short-range ballistic missiles, drone boats, mines. The Arabian Sea, where the Lincoln was operating, provides more space. The Lincoln was approximately 700 kilometers from the Iranian coastline. This put it inside the engagement envelope of Iran's most capable long-range weapons, but outside the range of most of Iran's shorter-range systems. The Lincoln was in challenging but manageable threat space. The eastern Mediterranean, where the Ford was positioned, is approximately 1,200 miles from Iran's western border, which translates to roughly 2,000 kilometers. This is at the outer edge of Iran's longest-range ballistic missile capability. Iran's most capable anti-ship weapons could theoretically reach the Ford's operating area only if launched from western Iran at maximum range against a target whose precise position was known. At 2,000 kilometers, the geometry of the targeting problem became nearly impossible for Iran. The distance means a hypersonic weapon takes longer to reach the target, giving it more time to maneuver away. The curvature of the Earth at that range limits Iran's over-the-horizon radar coverage. The sheer distance makes accurate terminal guidance extraordinarily demanding. The Ford was in a position where it could strike Iran, but Iran could barely threaten it back. The Ford's strikes from the Mediterranean were not simply long-range attacks against targets near Iran's western border. The eastern Mediterranean position gave the Ford's aircraft access to a strike corridor that the Lincoln could not cover. Iran's nuclear facilities and hardened military infrastructure are spread across a large geographic area. The Lincoln, operating in the Arabian Sea, could strike targets in southern and southeastern Iran relatively efficiently. Its aircraft had relatively short transit times to the coast and could carry heavier payloads because they had less distance to fly. The Ford's aircraft, striking from the Mediterranean through Israeli airspace or over Jordan and Iraq, could reach targets in western and northwestern Iran, targets near Tehran, targets near the command and control infrastructure in western provinces, targets that a Lincoln strike would require hours of transit to reach, burning fuel and limiting payload in the process. The combined strike envelope of both carriers simultaneously covered essentially all of Iran's strategic military infrastructure, with no geographic sanctuary from either direction. But the Ford was contributing something beyond geographic coverage. It was contributing to the deception operation that protected both carriers. With the Ford in the Mediterranean and the Lincoln in the Arabian Sea, Iranian commanders faced a targeting problem that divided their defensive attention across two fundamentally different threat axes. Resources committed to tracking and targeting the Ford could not simultaneously track and target the Lincoln. Electronic intelligence assets watching the Mediterranean could not simultaneously watch the Arabian Sea. The Ford's 1,200-mile distance from Iran was not just a defensive choice. It was a forcing function that compelled Iran to split its limited surveillance and targeting resources across two widely separated threat vectors, while both carriers continued to generate strikes at sustained rates. The Ford's deployment also served a critical alliance function that rarely appears in analysis focused purely on striking Iran. Israel had been the target of Iranian ballistic missile and drone attacks since the beginning of escalation in early 2026. The Iron Dome and Arrow systems that protect Israeli cities are extraordinarily capable, but not unlimited in their magazine depth. Sustained Iranian missile attacks that exhausted Israeli interceptor inventories could expose Israeli cities to the kind of mass casualty strikes that Iran's hardliners had been threatening for years. The Ford's position off Israel's coast with its Aegis-equipped destroyer escort provided an additional layer of ballistic missile defense for Israeli territory. The destroyers accompanying the Ford, the USS Winston S. Churchill, USS Bainbridge, and USS Mahan, each carried SM-3 and SM-6 interceptors capable of engaging Iranian ballistic missiles in their mid-course phase, well before they reached Israeli airspace. This is a capability that land-based Patriot and THAAD systems positioned at fixed known locations cannot replicate. A carrier strike group moves. Its Aegis ships can be repositioned within hours to cover a threat axis that fixed land-based systems cannot reach. When Iranian attack patterns shifted to target specific areas, the Ford strike group's Aegis ships repositioned to cover those areas. The Ford was simultaneously a strike platform generating sorties against Iran, a ballistic missile defense asset protecting Israel, and a strategic reserve that Iran had to account for in its planning even when it was not actively striking. 3 functions, 1 platform, 1,200 miles from Iran. The story of the Ford's Mediterranean deployment has a final chapter that the broader coverage of Operation Epic Fury largely missed. On March 7, 2026, the Ford left the Mediterranean and transited the Suez Canal into the Red Sea. The ship that had been 1,200 miles from Iran moved to a position from which it could contribute more directly to the sustained strike campaign that was continuing after the initial 48-hour assault had destroyed Iran's primary naval capability. The movement was a strategic signal. The Ford's entry into the Red Sea meant that Iran's already degraded command structure now faced carrier strike coverage from a third geographic direction in addition to the Arabian Sea and the Mediterranean that the Lincoln had been covering. It also meant the F-22 Raptors, based at Ovda Air Base in Israel, were now closer to Iranian targets they could reach from the Red Sea theater, and that the Ford's full sortie generation capacity was now available for strike missions rather than divided between strike and ballistic missile defense. The 1,200-mile position in the Mediterranean had served its purpose. It had protected the Ford during the most dangerous phase of the operation, when Iran's command structure was still partially functional and its missile forces were still attempting retaliatory strikes. By March 7th, Iran's ability to threaten the Ford with the weapons it had designed specifically to threaten carriers was significantly reduced. The trap had been sprung. The Ford moved forward to collect what remained. Iran had spent decades planning for a carrier that would have to enter the Persian Gulf to be effective. It had filled that Gulf with mines, fast attack craft, coastal missile batteries, and swarm weapons designed for confined water combat. The Ford never went to the Gulf. It sat 1,200 miles away and destroyed the targets it needed to destroy from there. The entire Iranian defensive architecture designed for close-range naval combat was irrelevant. The mines stayed unactivated. The coastal batteries had nothing in range to target. The fast attack craft never got orders to sortie. The trap was not for the Ford. The trap was for Iran's Navy, and Iran walked into it. This is Naval Depth. Subscribe and stay with us as this story continues. The 1,200-mile trap had one more element that deserves specific attention: the psychological and intelligence dimension of the Ford's Mediterranean deployment. Before the operation began, American planners understood that Iran's military planning was based on specific assumptions about where American carriers would be and how they would be used. Iran's doctrine for confronting American naval power was designed around the scenario of carriers entering the Persian Gulf or operating close to Iranian shores in the Arabian Sea, within range of the asymmetric capabilities Iran had spent decades developing. The Ford's presence in the Mediterranean violated every assumption built into that doctrine. Iranian planners had developed responses to carriers in the Gulf. They had rehearsed responses to carriers in the Arabian Sea. They had not developed comparable responses to a carrier 2,000 kilometers away, launching 160 sorties per day with aircraft that could reach targets across all of western Iran. The intelligence dimension of this positioning was also significant. In the weeks before Operation Epic Fury began, Iranian intelligence services were tracking American carrier movements closely. The Lincoln's deployment to the Arabian Sea was expected and fitted Iranian planning assumptions. The Ford's movement from the Caribbean to the Mediterranean, while public knowledge through open-source tracking presented a deployment geometry that Iranian commanders had not planned around. Iranian military planning for a confrontation with the United States involved specific scenarios: carriers in the Gulf, carriers in the northern Arabian Sea, land-based American aircraft operating from Gulf state air bases. The Ford in the eastern Mediterranean, simultaneously attacking through Israeli airspace and potentially through Jordanian and Iraqi airspace, created strike corridors that Iranian air defense planners had not adequately resourced. The coverage gap in Iranian air defenses over western Iran was a known vulnerability in American planning. The Ford's Mediterranean position was the key that opened it. Additionally, the Ford's position allowed for a degree of operational unpredictability that the Lincoln's fixed role in the Arabian Sea could not provide. Iranian commanders tracking the Lincoln could make reasonable predictions about the range and direction of Lincoln strike packages. The Ford could strike from the Mediterranean, then transit the Suez, and strike from the Red Sea, then potentially move further east, creating a shifting threat axis that Iranian planners had to account for simultaneously with the Lincoln's more predictable presence. The 1,200-mile trap was not just about protection. It was about generating uncertainty in Iranian planning that compounded the disruption caused by the time-on-target opening strike. Uncertainty is a weapon. The Ford wielded it from the Mediterranean, 1,200 miles away, while never firing a single defensive weapon against a threat that reached it. That was the trap, and it worked. A final note on what the Ford's Mediterranean deployment means for future American carrier doctrine. The traditional model of carrier deployment in American naval thinking placed the carrier as close to the threat as the threat environment permitted. Closer means shorter transit times for strike aircraft, heavier payloads because less fuel is burned in transit, and faster response to emerging targets. The Persian Gulf, despite its dangers, was considered the optimal operating area for carriers conducting sustained strike operations against Iran. Operation Epic Fury replaced that model with something different. The Ford demonstrated that a carrier operating at standoff distance, using its sortie generation advantage to keep aircraft continuously airborne rather than optimizing individual sortie payloads, can achieve strike effects across a broader target set than a single carrier operating closer to the threat. The sortie rate advantage matters more at scale than the payload advantage matters per sortie. Generating 160 sorties per day from 1,200 miles away produces more total strike capacity than generating 100 sorties per day from 700 miles away, even accounting for the difference in aircraft payload at the two ranges. This is the operational logic that explains why the Ford stayed in the Mediterranean while the Lincoln operated in the Arabian Sea. The two carriers were not performing the same mission from different positions. They were performing complementary missions that together created a strike architecture no single carrier could achieve alone. The Mediterranean distance was not a compromise. It was an optimization for what the Ford did best: generate sorties at maximum rate against the broadest possible target set, from a position that minimized the threat to the platform while maximizing the threat it posed to the adversary. In a future conflict against a more sophisticated adversary, this operational model of paired carriers at complementary standoff distances, each optimized for different threat axes, may become the standard American carrier deployment pattern rather than the exception. The Ford's 1,200-mile position may have been the blueprint for how America fights its next major naval war.